I'm going to move on to the next slide, but Katie put some information in the chat if you want a direct link out to the MCSS page and reference the hashtag. The slides and handouts, which today are just slides, are available on the Student Success Summit webpage. Honestly, the slides there's not a whole lot to the slides today because mostly this will be a panel discussion and conversation, but you can find that there. For those of you who were unable to attend some of our earlier sessions that we hosted last week, this is also the website where you will be able to find slides from previous sessions, and we will also be posting the recording here as well when we continue with, once we get all of these recordings updated, that's where we'll post this information as well, and then we'll share that pretty widely throughout the Student Success Center network. I referenced our agenda a little bit earlier, so we'll just start with some welcome and introductions. As I mentioned, I'm excited to join 4 of my colleagues in a panel discussion that focuses on federal and state policy today. We will gather audience questions through the chat. So if you do have a question that you want to ask the panelists, please add that question to the chat, and then we will close out our session before we send you on to the rest of your day. All right, with that sort of administrivia out of the way, I am going to turn it over to the president of the Michigan Community College Association, Mike Hansen, who will be moderating our panel today and introducing our speakers. Mike, can you unmute yourself?
There we go. Even though Erica said there would be no technology that I'd need to do, and already I've had to unmute myself. That was, but anyway, welcome everybody, and it's great to see everybody's face, even though it's small. I can see you in my Hollywood squares, and we'll start right off with introducing our terrific lineup here of panelists. We'll start because he's on my left, Dr. Bill Pink, the president of Grand Rapids Community College. I think who many of you know already. As a college president, you have to wear many hats, and Bill today will be wearing many hats, not only as president of Grand Rapids Community College, but Bill is also on the ACE board, the American Council of Education board, and the AACC board of directors, the American Association of Community Colleges. So Bill will be able to provide a number of different perspectives, both nationally and locally, on some of these topics. So we're excited, Bill, to have you join us here today. And then next, my colleague, Aaron Shore, who is the vice president here at the association, and most of anything good that comes out of this association has probably got Aaron's fingerprints on it more than mine. Aaron has a wide background in legislative experience and started as our legislative director, and now also has that role in addition to being vice president. So we'll be interested in hearing sort of the state perspective from Aaron. And then my good friend and colleague, Jihang Lee, from the Association of Community College Trustees, ACCT. Jihang is their senior vice president for public policy. He comes with many years of experience in federal advocacy work, not only for community colleges, but his general understanding of the federal process is incredibly valuable. As you know, the MCCA here, we focus mainly on state policy issues, and we rely very heavily on the work that Jihang and his colleagues do in the federal realm. So it will be great to hear, as all of you know, there's a lot of activity right now in Washington. And so we're excited to hear about Jihang's perspective. So I think we'll just get started. And again, as Erica said, if you've got questions along the way, include them in the chat, and we'll try to get to those as best we can. And we'll leave some time at the end to get to questions. But I think we'll start with this issue of the elections that are coming up. I think most of you have heard that there is an election that'll happen here in November. And while a lot of the attention right now is on the federal election, the president's election, there are also 110 House members here in the state of Michigan who are up for election. And so, Aaron, maybe I'll start with you for this first question. And what do you think the implications are for the statewide elections for the House members? What are the implications of this election for community colleges specifically?
That's a good question, Mike. Some of you may be more familiar with the federal election setup, and I know Ji-Hang will speak to that in a minute here. Unlike the US Senate, where members run for terms every 6 years and they're sort of staggered, and Michigan does have a Senate election this year. Senators in Michigan are elected for 4-year terms at the same time that the governor is, along with our other statewide elected officials, the lieutenant governor, the secretary of state, and the attorney general. So all of those people were elected in 2018 and will presumably continue serving for another 2 years before they're up for election. So it really is all about the House of Representatives here in Michigan. As most of you likely know, we have pretty strict term limits here in the state of Michigan. You're allowed to serve 3 2-year terms in the House of Representatives, and then you're not allowed to run again. And so what that ends up meaning is that when the Senate and those other positions are up, there's a lot more shuffling than just a third of the members. So we saw a tremendous amount of change coming out of the 2018 election. This one will be a little bit quieter. It is only the House of Representatives, and it's probably only no more than about 30 of the members that are running up against term limits and unable to run again and leaving open seats. It's very difficult to unseat an incumbent legislator, although it does happen from time to time. So it's usually about those open seats and whether anything changes there. There is only right now a 58-52 split in the House of Representatives, with the Republicans having majority both in the House and in the Senate. And from what we're seeing right now, and it's still a little bit early in election terms, although these days with everyone voting absentee, it's not as early as it used to be. It looks like things are leaning a little bit toward the Democrats in some of those open seats. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens. We could end up with potentially a flip in control where the Democrats take the House, or we could end up with something that we haven't seen since back in the 90s, when there's actually a 55-55 tie and they have to work out a balance of shared power, which was really interesting. I didn't work here at the time, but people that did talked about how they would switch control of committees every month and switch control of the floor every month. So it'll be very interesting. What's certain, almost certain, is that the Republicans will probably lose even a teeny bit more of their majority, even if they hang on to control. So it'll be an interesting challenge, but the governor will certainly still be working with the Republican Senate. So we're going to continue to have divided government no matter what happens in this election here in Michigan.
Yeah, I was here during that shared power, and even though it sounds chaotic, it actually worked pretty smoothly.
That's what I hear. People that worked under it talked about how it was a couple of the best years they had ever seen, because people didn't really have a choice but to work together. And of course, that was before term limits kicked in, so people had different relationships than they do now.
Right.
But working for community colleges, we're very fortunate to have strong relationships on both sides of the aisle. So we don't tend to see things in those same partisan terms. And I think when we get into funding, you can see some of that. But we have seen a lot of support from legislators, both Republican and Democrat. So from that perspective, I don't expect as much to change as another interest group might see coming out of the election.
Yeah. Well, as polarizing sometimes as we feel politics are right now and at the state level, it's just really magnified at the federal level, Ji-Hang. And so clearly, if we have a new president, that'll have huge implications, we believe, on community colleges, but also the balance of power in Congress is up with the Senate, that could flip. So from the inside the Beltway perspective, if you will, Ji-Hang, what do you think the implications of this national election could be on community colleges?
Mikey, thank you for the introduction and the question. So for those of you who don't know, we are 41 days away from the general election. So not that I'm counting down or anything. one of the things that we are watching candidly is not necessarily the presidential race in terms of legislation. We are watching the Senate races. And that's because earlier last year, Senator Lamar Alexander, who's chair of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, announced that he was retiring from Congress. As many of you know, Senator Alexander is a big champion at FAFSA reform. And always talks about reducing the number of questions for the FAFSA. Since he is departing, we're going to have a new chairperson for the Health Committee. So the two prospective Republican chairs, if the Republicans maintain the majority, would be Senator Richard Burr, who's from North Carolina, and also Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. So obviously from our broad perspective, Senator Alexander was a former Secretary of Education and also was a president of a 4-year land-grant institution. So he has a strong higher education background. When you look at Senator Paul and you look at Senator Burr, their experience or their knowledge base around community colleges and more specific on a more global level, higher education is a little bit more limited. And so that's something that we are paying attention to for the most part. We do expect that if the Senate Democrats take majority, that Senator Patty Murray, who's the current ranking member of the Health Committee, will be ascend to the chairmanship. And Senator Patty Murray has been a strong champion of community colleges. For an example, she led the effort with Senator Schumer on the minority leader to include headcount as a formula allocation for resources in the Senate Democrats' piece of legislation for stimulus. So we are expecting that we'll have some positive results, especially if Patty Murray becomes a chair. On the House side, we don't expect that the House will flip to the Republican side. Most prognosticators are saying that the Democrats will retain the majority. They may lose a couple seats, but they would still retain the majority. And if that is the case, we expect Chairman Bobby Scott to also continue on as chair of the Education and Labor Committee. And we've had strong working relationships with Chairman Scott. He has proposed legislation such as College Promise, Community College Success Grants, and offered certain provisions like short-term Pell, second chance Pell, major priorities of our organization. So those are some of the things that we're concerned about and looking towards as we expect some results coming soon from elections.
Good. Well, thank you, Jiheng, for that inside perspective. Dr. Pink, you've got to pay attention both to federal politics because of your role on some of these national boards, but also state and local politics. But from your perspective, what does all this mean for your college? You know, at the ground level, do elections really matter? Do you follow them carefully, or what do you think the impact of both these national and state elections could have on your college?
So thank you, Mike. And honored to be a part of this panel. I will say to those who are listening to this, I will tell you the same thing I said to Jiheng and Mike when we discussed this. I am so apologetic that on the screen I did not wear a dark suit, light blue shirt, and a red tie with design. I apologize. That is on me. We'll send you the right picture next time. It's good to see faces on here. Mike, it's always good to see you and Aaron and Erica and the whole staff. So I'll be brief because what Aaron and Jiheng talked about is so indicative in terms of what we're seeing from a state and federal perspective. So statewide with what Aaron talked about, and yes, as an institution, we do indeed keep an eye on what's happening at the state because for one thing, we want to make sure as we engage with our local legislators that we are doing so in a very responsive way. And so that we're providing them the information about the work of the community college so that they understand what we do so that when they are in Lansing, they can indeed make those decisions with us in mind and our the things that we need as a community college, both here locally and across the state. I will say from the board work on AACC and ACE, something that we have talked about as a board over this past summer into present day is with the election, and we look at it a lot at the federal level in terms of the presidency here in the United States. And so what we talk about is from a standpoint of both administrations. So we look at it and say, okay, if we have a re-election and the Trump administration is in again, what does that mean for, and what could that mean for community college? Well, and as well as with the Biden administration, with both of those individuals, we kind of look backwards. So with the Trump administration, we look back over the last 3.5 years and ask the question, how has that administration, how have they been when it comes to community colleges? And what the AACC president, Walter Bumpus, would tell you is that the conversations that he has and others have with the Trump administration when it comes to community colleges is a very favorable conversation in terms of how they understand our work and in terms of how they believe the support of our work is vital. Now, side note about whether or not the president himself knows the difference in vocational and community colleges and what that picture looks. When we talk about that administrative body, those who are meeting on a regular basis with our community college representatives, they are right there in terms of understanding what those needs are. So that's a positive. But I would also say, we again look backwards with the Biden administration. If there's a Biden presidential administration, what does that look like? Well, let's look backwards. Well, we have no reason to think that that wouldn't be favorable as well, because of what we saw with the Obama administration and the vice president being in that role and how favorable that was and supportive they were of community colleges and shining a very bright light on the work of community colleges, aside from the fact of Dr. Jill Biden being having such a background with community colleges. We believe that that they would have a very strong understanding as well, and an affinity toward the good work that happens in community colleges. So from a perspective of that, as far as the understanding of the work of our institutions, we feel pretty confident either way. But I would say the big concern then becomes our students. So some of our student populations, what would that look like? And the one that we look at so much is our DACA population. What is the, what would the affinity be there for those DACA students? And so it's some of those specific student groups that we would pay more of a drill down attention to in terms of which administration is in place. But from a standpoint of the community colleges, we feel pretty good about both of those administrations in understanding our work and who we are.
Thanks for that, Bill. And I think that's all, interesting to what it means for a lot of us, however, is 6 more weeks of political ads. And for most of us are already sick of those, but in 6 weeks, it'll all be over. And then in Michigan, we will be in what we call a lame duck session. And it took me several years of working down here before I was really clear on what a lame duck session was. But Aaron, maybe for the rest of us, you could help explain what a lame duck session is and what happens in a lame duck session and what does this matter for community colleges?
It's a very technical term we use for the session that happens between the election and the period of time when people finish out that term of office that they were elected to previously before the new term starts. So I think there's some sort of thinking that the duck isn't quite whole, it can't necessarily fly anymore, but it's still got some juice, it's not dead completely. So they tend to be very busy sessions, at least here in Michigan. It's often a time when complicated issues get finalized because much like students, much like probably many of us, there's nothing to motivate legislators like a good deadline that they're up against. For example, back in 2012, when community colleges in Michigan got authority to offer baccalaureate degrees in 4 program areas, that happened on the last day of our lame duck session. It's often a time when things like capital outlay projects get approved, and critics would tell you that sometimes legislators are less responsive to voters during that time, especially the ones that aren't able to run for re-election. But it does tend to be a busy and productive time. So we will likely see a considerable amount of action during those 6 weeks between the election and the end of December when they break. And then next year will be a particularly interesting time because, as you all know, the census is going on. And so I think we have a week. If you haven't finalized your census information, make sure you do that, and all of your neighbors, because one of the many things that will be used to determine is next year the redistricting process that we go through every 10 years, which traditionally has been handled by the legislature and then signed into law by the governor. But in Michigan in 2018, the voters passed an independent redistricting commission, which will draw the lines next year instead of the legislature doing that. They have begun to meet, they're just sort of getting their bearings, but it will be interesting to see how that process compares to the maps that we have seen under a partisan map drawing. Michigan does have a set of standards for drawing legislative districts, and there's only so much variation you're allowed to use. You have to try and keep cities and counties and things contiguous if you can, but there's always a certain amount of wiggle room in interpretation of those things. And so this will be the first time that we have that process handled by an independent commission rather than by the legislators themselves. And it'll be interesting to see where that changes districts.
There are many people that say that redistricting could be one of the bigger, political shifts in the landscape that we've seen in this state in a number of years. And so I agree, it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. For those of you that are real geeks about this, go look up your local Congress or House member or Senate member in Michigan. Look at their district. Many of them make no sense at all. And clearly were written and drawn in a way to favorable one group or party over the other. So it'll be very clear or interesting to see how this new redistricting takes shape and what impact that has on future elections.
It will, and perhaps just one more piece of impetus for legislators to get as many things accomplished during this lame duck session as they can.
Very true. So let's go to funding. Today in the state capitol, they are working on finalizing the state budget for next year. But what has been top of mind for most of us over the last several months during the pandemic is the federal stimulus in helping states and other entities cope with some of the disastrous funding losses due to COVID. So Jihang, maybe I can turn back to you and maybe is there an update you can provide us on what's the latest in the next stimulus round? We thought in August that they were very close to doing another round of stimulus and then everything sort of fell apart. What's the current status?
There's 2 funding vehicles right now that we're tracking. So relative to the stimulus legislation, many of you know that in May of earlier this year, the House Democrats passed their stimulus legislation that provided over $3 trillion for the next round of stimulus funds. We call that Stimulus 4. Senate Majority Leader McConnell took a little bit more of a deliberate approach to stimulus legislation and didn't start crafting his legislation until after July 4th. They released theirs, which was about $1 trillion. And the White House, for the most part, has been negotiating with the House Democrats during that time period to try to craft a piece of legislation. The House Democrats haven't moved on at least getting $2.2 trillion in terms of total funding on stimulus. So effectively right now, stimulus legislation is pretty much dead. Although the president earlier last week or late last week did announce that he would be supportive of providing more resources for any stimulus legislation. But that did not get a ringing endorsement from the Senate Majority Leader. So therefore, we're expecting this stimulus legislation to be on hold until at least the election. And in all likelihood, we're looking at probably the 117th Congress, which will begin in early January, to be on the hook to push any stimulus legislation. Obviously, that's of significant concern since our colleges have had significant amount of challenges in supporting our students, configuring its operations to online instruction, and the need for increased student financial aid has been particular note. But at this point, we're probably just expecting activity in the beginning of the 117th Congress. The other thing that we're tracking is the federal government operates on a October 1st, September 30th fiscal year. So therefore, being that it's September 23rd, we have about approximately a week before the end of the fiscal year. If we don't do anything, the government goes into shutdown, which you all are aware has serious ramifications. The House Democrats last night passed their CR that they had been negotiating with the White House. We have an expectation that this CR, continuing resolution that provides funding for the government, will pass the Senate or with some modifications. And the date that they're looking for the CR to continue on to is December 11th. So that kind of gives you an indication that after the election, the House leaders and Senate leaders will work on something. If typically, though, I will say when you have, especially a new president coming in, they typically kick the can down the road a little bit past inauguration. So, for example, in March, I can tell you that when President Trump took office, I believe he finally passed his first appropriations bill, I believe in April of his first year in office. And those were provisions that were articulated under the Obama administration and the Congress back then. But so you see a significant amount of delay in terms of activity, especially if you have a changeover in power. So that's just, and so other things of note, just so you know, we are trying to get a Pell Grant maximum increase for this forthcoming year. We're trying to get at least a $100 increase in the maximum. The House Democratic bill that they passed in July, the appropriations bill, where all appropriations bills are supposed to start, they actually also included a provision to allow second chance Pell. So that's some note. So we are hopeful to get some additional resources, especially for the Pell program, and also get some additional resources for community college job training programs to support our programs at our colleges.
Well, the federal stimulus is important, not only to state governments, but also to community colleges. We ended up here in Michigan getting $36 million in some of this federal stimulus because of a replacement that the state made with our state money, because the state was out of money and they replaced some of that with federal stimulus money. Aaron, maybe you can help kind of walk us through the budget process. And I know the budget for next year, the one that starts next week and October 1st, is being debated right now, actually, as we speak, in the House of Representatives here across the street from us. What do we know so far about what's going to be in that budget?
Well, that's a good question, Mike. The details really just started to come out this morning. It's been a very interesting budget process so far this year. Some of you may recall last year when the legislature and the governor did not work together to negotiate a budget. So the legislature sent one to the governor anyway, and then she vetoed or refused to spend a lot of the items that the legislature had included. That really informed this year's process, as has a lot of the back and forth over her handling of the COVID situation and the emergency powers, all of which were factors in getting to a late agreement on this budget. But one of the biggest factors was, like Mike said, the question of finances. In Michigan, we typically have two what they call consensus revenue estimating conferences, one in January to start work on the budget, and then a follow-up in May just to finalize the numbers. And in a normal year, if such a thing exists, it's just a small tweak in May, and then we are able to finalize the budget in early or midsummer. As you all know, by May, COVID had hit, things were closed down, the numbers coming in were terrible. Nobody could predict anything in terms of income tax revenue because the deadlines had been pushed back into July. So the parties, the fiscal agencies, and the Department of Treasury here in Michigan scheduled a relatively unprecedented third revenue estimating conference in August and held their breath and hoped that the numbers would get better. And as luck would have it, it did. We were fortunate here in Michigan that the early actions that everyone in the state took got our numbers down, and we were able to open activity back up in a considerable way, and lots of people were able to work from home and do other things, not to mention the sizable federal stimulus that came through that really helped keep a lot of families afloat with those pandemic insurance payments and the plans to local businesses, the loans that went out. All of that meant that the $2 or $3 billion budget deficit that we thought we would be facing for this year back in May almost completely evaporated by the time they looked at the numbers in August, which was fantastic. Community colleges did take a pretty significant cut in the past year, like Mike alluded to. The state did try and ameliorate that by eliminating some state funding and then backfilling it with federal funding from the CARES Act coronavirus relief funds. But that can't be spent quite the same way. It had to be spent only on COVID-related new costs, nothing that had been budgeted for. But considering the terrible budget that we thought we were going to be looking at this year, we could not be more pleased. We're looking at a budget that has already passed the Senate and will be passing the House presumably later today, that takes community college operations funding back to what it was last year before the July cuts. Not only that, we know the governor has taken $24 million of her education relief funds that she received directly and used that to start the Futures for Frontliners program to provide college scholarships starting in January for anyone who was required to work during the most critical period of the pandemic, those early weeks when we didn't know everything about safety. The budget agreement includes another $30 million for the Reconnect program that was passed into law back in March, but then they had to strip the funding away and put that toward public health, as well as reinstating $28 million for the Going Pro training fund, which I know some of our colleges are involved with as well. So it really is a tremendous win in terms of investing in resources, both for college operations as well as student financial aid, that particularly goes directly to community colleges. Reconnect and Futures for Frontliners are not programs that the other kinds of institutions can take advantage of by and large. So we've already seen in the early days of applying for Futures for Frontliners, it's been not quite 2 weeks, and they've had 50,000 applicants across the state. We'll see how many of those are eligible, and many of those are people who are already on your campuses, but it's quite clear that these have the potential to be transformative for colleges.
Yeah, I want to get back to those two programs, Aaron, the Futures for Frontliners and Reconnect. But before I do, let's finish up this budget conversation. Bill, it sounds and it feels a little bit like a roller coaster. I know we were advising college presidents back in March and April and May that be prepared for about a 10 or 15% cut this year and then again next year. And then in July, they cut you 11%, but gave you 11% back in federal money that was going to be hard to spend because there were a lot of strings attached. And now they're doing a flat budget for next year. In the meantime, your enrollments are going up and down. How do you possibly manage this fiscal situation with a large institution like yours, not knowing what the budget situation, what revenues might look like for next year? How can you do any planning around that?
It's you mentioned roller coaster, Mike, roller coaster, tightrope, all those descriptors. And with what Aaron just talked about, the whole idea from a state appropriation perspective, what we were looking at as college presidents was not only that gap as far as state appropriation, but also the fallacy that was out there early in the summer that, oh my goodness, you community colleges, you guys are going to get a ton of enrollment because of all these students that are going to opt for community college instead of four-year schools. And you guys are going to be busting at the seams. Well, I call it a fallacy because that did not come true for several reasons from what we hear from our students. Now, did we see some enrollment from that? I believe so. But did we see the influx that was predicted? Well, no, because number one, students are telling us that many, as I was just talking to someone early today, there are a lot of students that are sitting this one out. They're staying at home for reasons of fear around COVID, also for reasons around being very tentative about not wanting to be in a virtual environment with their education. And so there are some, there are many that we have found are making that choice. And then thirdly, if they lost a job, they're trying to get work again. And college is going to be one of those things that comes later on for them. And so those challenges, Mike, have been where we've been sitting as far as enrollment is concerned and a state appropriation, both coming in lower than what we would want them to do. So what do? Well, it's around the budget process of making sure that as we start in, and as we started in back, as you mentioned, back in the spring, started in on looking at FY21, how we then started talking about how we tighten those purse strings down. We implemented what I call a hiring frost, not a freeze, but a frost. A frost is that you still hire those positions that you just, you have to replace this one. A campus policeman retires or whatever, I need to replace him or her. Some of those positions that we know we need that one filled, but some of those that we felt like we could hold off on, some of those being held off on rather than hiring immediately, seeing some cost savings there. Also, just the idea of, for us, aside from those type of mitigating moves budget-wise, it's important to me that we're transparent in our communication with our campus to let them know, here's what our situation is. Here's where we are tightening our belt straps. And then we see our campus community seeing how they can tighten those belt straps as well. Because that transparency in communication is vital. And I think that type of transparency has to start in times of good, so that the times of hard, that communication line is already established. And so it's vital that that communication from administration to campus is apparent in those times that we're not experiencing a pandemic, so that when a pandemic does come, they are used to the communication and we can truly be transparent. But that's how we've been able to do it, Mike, is being very forthcoming in terms of what our campus situation is, then seeing our campus respond in a good way, all the while making sure that we are keeping a close eye on what's happening at our state level and with our enrollment, because both of those are so important.
Yeah, and I know this enrollment issue has been a concern, not just for you, obviously, but all of your colleagues. There was, as you said, there were early predictions that because of the recession and the pandemic and students would stay home and go to their local community college, that our enrollments would be going through the roof in the fall. Quite the opposite has happened. But Aaron, and it's come up here in the chat a couple of times, now that the governor and the legislature have funded both Reconnect and Futures for Frontliners, maybe this will have a positive impact on enrollment. What do you think we can expect, and when do you think we might be able to start seeing the benefit in terms of enrollment increases because of these two new programs?
It's a good question, Mike. So with Futures for Frontliners, we've seen that the announcement has already gone out and applications are open to students. You have to apply by December 31st, and then you can start taking classes as early as January, although you don't have to start immediately in January of next year. But once you start under that program, people who are eligible for the Futures for Frontliners program have, I believe, 4 years to complete their eligibility, although the funding that's out there initially will probably only fund the first semester year. It's a little tough to say until we find out more about how many people apply and also how much federal aid they qualify for, because that'll be a real question of whether the state is picking up the bulk of the cost or whether the federal government is picking up a lot for those students. As we are working through a lot of the technical details for Futures for Frontliners with both the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, or LEO, and Treasury, both of whom some of you may have seen communications from, we're learning a lot of the processes and procedures that are going to come into play for both programs. And so what I think has become clear is that we can all expect Reconnect to piggyback a little bit on Futures for Frontliners, knowing that it's not yet signed into law, that we already have this other program that's picking up significant interest that will start enrollment in January. What I'm hearing for Reconnect is that they're hoping for probably a spring launch, although that's not certain yet. So people could be applying perhaps sometime after the first of the year, but not enrolling until a spring or summer term.
Yeah, good. That's helpful. You know, Bill, one thing we do know about these two programs is that it'll likely mean an influx of adult students. Certainly Reconnect is only open for people that are over 25, and of course, Futures for Frontliners, anybody working in those industries. And so the enrollment surge that you may get here soon is likely going to be from adult students. What is your college doing to prepare itself or yourself for this big influx in adult students? Do you prepare for them differently than you do recent high school grads? What is it specifically about adult students that you're doing at Grand Rapids Community College?
And I also think that with what we're seeing with, as Aaron mentioned earlier, with Futures for Frontliners, I think honestly, when you see in the first week over 50,000 folks come to that application process, I think that probably gives good traction for the notion that Reconnect makes such good sense because of the number of people who are saying, yeah, this is what I need to do. And so I think Reconnect probably gets that same, even much better traction. So for us, that adult learner is important to us, just as our traditional 18-year-old who comes out of the high school. There are those things within those two populations that are very different, but I'll tell you, there are many things that stay the same. Number one, we're very mindful of what we've gone through here in these last several months. Some of those learners, those adult learners, some of them really want to see an instructor face-to-face. We're hearing more and more about students that say, I want to be on campus. I want to be face-to-face with my instructor. But if it's during a COVID-19 environment, some of them saying, I'll just wait to get that. And so we know that some of those traditional students are in that space. We see quite a few more, in my mind, of our non-traditional, our older adult students who really want that face-to-face interaction. For us, it's important to be mindful with those individuals of the times that our delivery happens and the modes that our delivery happens. When I say delivery of courses. So that we're making sure that what we rolled out, 6 months to a year ago, of weekend college, making sure that folks on the weekend can access us. More in terms of 7-week courses rather than just saying, here's the whole semester course, having a mixture of those, but also when those are offered. And as we've gone into during these last several weeks, different delivery modes. So whether it be online or a virtual, where it's just like this type of education in a Zoom format, hybrid of mixture of both, and making sure we're on ground as well. Making sure we are throwing all those things out so that we're giving maximum opportunity. And then also with what we do around all of our CTE and non-credit work, making sure the accessibility and the relevance of those stays true. And the last thing I'll say to that, Mike, is our partnership with our industry partners, because we want to make sure that on the other side of that education, that there's either a 4-year school that student is ready to go to, a job that they're ready to go to, or in some cases both, that they're going to a job and also interacting with some of our 4-year transfer partners. Making sure those pathways are there is very important for those populations, because those adult populations want to see what their next is going to be, and if GRCC is a pathway to that next.
I think that makes so much sense, Dr. Pink. We've all spent a lot of time talking about the reasons that up until now we haven't seen the influx of students that you normally would see during an economic downturn. And I think you really hit the nail on the head for a few of those. I mean, with all the uncertainty in the economy, we already had people questioning the value of a degree and whether it was worth shelling out those costs. And I think it's just reinforcing that there are a lot of families who aren't willing to make that leap or just don't have the extra cash set aside to make something like this happen without the state stepping in for support. And then even for those families that can, they're just navigating a lot of things right now. And I know I'm probably not the only person on this call who has other people at home that are doing online learning and juggling all of that. And there have been tears shed in my household during the first 2 weeks of school, I'll tell you that, by more than one of us. So. And we're pretty fortunate to have good internet access and all of that. I can only imagine what some of our students are struggling with.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've already returned 2 computers to our school system, and they've had to give us new replacements. So it is a nightmare that we're all living through.
Yeah. Well, Jihang, I want to close with you. This will be our final question because we want to leave some time for questions. And you know, you and I both started our positions here about the same time. And so since I've been here, higher ed reauthorization has been right around the corner for the last 15 years. Do you think it'll finally happen here soon? Or what's the status with the Higher Ed Reauthorization Act?
So I would have said that there was growing momentum to try to get some provisions done within the context of the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. We're about 5 years after the bill, quote unquote, needed to be authorized. So it takes some momentum for us to ultimately move pieces of legislation. For those of you who follow K through 12 or have a child in an elementary school or high school, the No Child Left Behind Act, which was up for reauthorization, I believe in 2008. It took about 6 years for that piece of legislation to finally move, and they were ultimately able to move it just because people hated the term Common Core, and they hated there was a building momentum around addressing that piece of legislation. In terms of HEA, the Senate held a hearing last week, as I mentioned, Senator Lamar Alexander, the chairman, to talk about FAFSA reform, and it's his big thing. He wants to do it. Senator Murray didn't pan the idea of finally doing some short-term fix on the FAFSA, so which could have been a shorter, smaller HEA fix. Given where we are today versus last Thursday, based upon the passing of our Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what's happening in Washington D.C. inside the Beltway, I don't think the odds are great that the Senate Democrats and especially the House Democrats would pass any piece of legislation that passed through the Senate right now. So that's kind of the backdrop of the first, the next 70, 90 days. I do think, though, that if the House Democrats retain power, the Senate Democrats take over power, and President Biden or Vice President Biden gets elected president, I do think there would be significant odds that there would be a HEA bill. The big question marks is there's a strong bipartisan support for things like increasing the Pell Grant maximum, doing short-term Pell, doing second chance Pell. The broadest disagreements arise, and even College Promise has strong support amongst, especially the Democratic caucus. Where you see significant fissuring, especially in the Democratic caucus, is around the idea of debt forgiveness and what that price level of debt forgiveness looks like. So that is something that we're kind of watching and having conversations with the Hill staff. They kind of have, the House Democrats led by Chairman Scott have gravitated towards the idea of if you have distressed borrowers, students who are in default or 6 months in delinquency, they would be chosen or given some type of debt forgiveness as part of that endeavor. I think they'll probably look towards somewhere in the neighborhood of $5,000 to $10,000 worth of debt forgiveness, not broad $50,000 debt forgiveness. One of the things that we typically have argued on debt forgiveness is that, especially for community college students, our students are our students who are defaulters typically default on lower amounts. So dollar amounts of $5,000 or less are a key indicator of defaulters amongst our community. And that has, the Hill has gravitated towards the idea that they would especially want to help those students who are at the highest risk of default. I do also think in terms of HEA, there'll be some conversations about how they can, if they don't do, let's say, $50,000 of debt forgiveness for everybody, are there additional loan forgiveness programs outside of, for example, public service loan forgiveness that might be of interest to legislators? But I don't know. There's just so many balls in the air, and typically what I will say is that the Senate Republicans still retain majority. It will take time for Senator Burr or Senator Paul to kind of leave their mark on the committee before they actually start embarking. So it might take a year or two before even that committee really goes gangbusters on trying to fix or address the reauthorization. So there are some broad outstanding questions, but I do think there is an idea that we could finally see HEA and especially deal with all those issues that have been outstanding for us.
Well, Jiheng, you mentioned the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it also came up in the chat. If we presume that the Senate will confirm the president's nominee before the election, and if we assume that that nominee will be a conservative justice, what impact do you think a more conservative court might have on community colleges?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think one of the most recent case that affected our institutions dealt with the docket decision that was out earlier this year. I believe whoever is president, they'll have to address it. I believe the administration is doing a 1-year extension for DACA. They are not taking, the last I heard, taking new enrollments, even though the court told them to take new enrollments. So that might be something that on the horizon, the court might have to deal with at an appointed time again. But typically, in terms of most things that affect our institutions, it doesn't necessarily run through the court system as much. Outside of the issues that we have seen with the CARES Act implementation, where the Department of Education has taken a position, and our colleges in California, Washington, and Massachusetts filed a suit against the Department of Education for taking a position that wasn't supported by Congress or wasn't specifically outlined by Congress. Namely, international students and DACA students should be eligible for the emergency funds out of the CARES Act. So I would say that's probably the only area where we would see some activity, but DACA is definitely one on the horizon if Congress does not fix and resolve, and pass a DREAM Act, for an example.
Good. Well, that also covered, at least partially covered another question in the chat about supporting DACA students through policy. Just to be clear, that Future for Frontliners is a state program, state funded, and so it's not restricted. The DACA students wouldn't be restricted in that program. But I'll turn this over to Erica now. I know she's also collected some questions, and I think we have a few more minutes left for those questions. So Erica.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you Bill and Aaron and Jihang for joining us. This is always one of my favorite sessions, and I always appreciate listening to you and your thoughts about these issues. As Mike said, we have a few questions that have come in through the chat, some of which Mike stole my thunder and asked some of those questions during the moderated part. So I invite everyone to continue to ask questions in the chat. We have 4 really excellent folks here who are ready to answer those questions, but I have captured a few through private chats and that kind of thing too. One thing that I thought, just to start us off, that is sort of an overarching question is, what, and maybe Aaron and Mike and Bill, this might be more for you, what do you feel is the general perception among policymakers of community colleges and the work that we do?
Yeah, I will start, just jump in. We have, I can speak for our local legislators as we have conversations with them. Their overall sentiment is very favorable to community colleges, mainly among other reasons, mainly because of the community colleges as we are serving the people of their districts and of their areas. And so when I say serving them, so with the work that we do around just associate degrees that lead to transfer or workforce training and job training, CTE training, and some of those that lead to jobs to the next school or both, many of our legislators realize that work and want to know how to support that work. I haven't had a single session yet, knock on wood, where going to the Capitol in Lansing, where whether it be testifying or whether it be just going to offices and speaking with those legislators, where I have found that I felt like it was oppositional to our work. Questions, definitely questions, and definitely wanting to gather information. But usually that has been, in my experiences, a very good relationship and a good, what I call favorable view of the work that we do.
I would say the same thing. I think usually when Mike and I talk to legislators, almost everyone has had a positive experience of some sort, whether they understand those workforce training relationships or whether they have a son or daughter that perhaps did dual enrollment or maybe came back and took some community college courses for a summer, whether they started there themselves. The range of understanding is pretty broad. From people that just see it as that, oh, I can pick up a course here or there, to people that really did start there and understand the full range of what community colleges can do and how pivotal they are for so many students. But by and large, I find that they're very favorable and that people really see that we're connected to our communities. For whatever reason, and this is true across the country, if you look at polling data, the universities are just more polarizing. And I think part of that is because we do have here in Michigan locally elected boards. People often stay in their community. And so, there's just a little bit more of that community flavor to a community college. Whereas if you have a Michigan State or a Michigan, those are tremendously important entities to your community, or even a smaller college like an Alma or something, but they don't bear the same relationship that a community college does, and I think that often works in our favor.
I would just follow up by saying, I think one of the greatest things that we need to do for policymakers is to talk about the full breadth of what our institutions do. When we go talk to legislators on Capitol Hill and their staff, sometimes it might just focalize on workforce and job training, or it might just talk a little bit about, it might just talk, for an example, on general education that leads to transfer. So I would say to you, an example of this, and this is really truly an important exercise that we have to embark on, is when Chairman Harkin was still in office and he was about to draft his reauthorization of the Education Act in 2014 before he retired. the staff proposed to us that they wanted to know all the results of all non-credit programs of all non-credit programs for all students. So as they proposed this item, we said, which non-credit programs are you talking about? And they said, all. And I said, would that include our adult basic education programs? Would that include the senior citizen who's taking pottery? Would include, they clearly wanted remedial education, but it became an exercise in trying to teach legislative staff who are writing the next reauthorization what it means, like use exact terms about what our institutions are doing.
Yeah.
And part of that's our chore as advocates, really start talking about all the things that our institutions do, so that when they do cut money from us, it's just not our transfer programs, it's just not workforce programs, but it's a holistic perspective of CTE programs, adult basic ed program, community-based programs for your senior citizens. The fact that we train the majority of first responders, the majority of childcare providers, all these programs that we run, this is the result of a funding loss for our institutions.
Great, thanks. Mike, we had a question in the chat. This week has been an exciting week for community colleges because the Senate, last week heard testimony and then voted on the ability for community colleges to offer the Bachelor of Science in Nursing. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that and what that's been like in Lansing over the last couple weeks.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. It has been sort of exciting. This came a little bit out of the blue to us. As many of you might know, we've been working on this issue for the last 10 or 15 years on the Community College Baccalaureate. In 2012, we were successful in getting a bill passed that included 4 programs, but it originally had 5. And that 5th program was the Bachelor of Science in Nursing, the BSN. It's the program that most colleges were interested in, but it was also the most controversial because it was the one that was most opposed by the universities. So it was dropped at the last minute. And so the bill that passed in 2012 had 4 programs without nursing in it. And really ever since then, the legislature, at least some in the legislature, have been interested in getting the BSN back and reinstated. It has gone through a number of different iterations, a number of different pieces of legislation over the years, and never really had much success, mainly because of the very fierce opposition by the four-year universities. This year, it was introduced a couple of weeks ago by Senator Nesbitt, who was a big supporter of the program when he was in the House, Representative Nesbitt. But it also has the very strong support, we understand, of the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Mike Shirkey. And for those of you that even just have a casual observance of politics, you probably understand that there are 2 very powerful people in the legislature, the Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader in the Senate. They essentially set the agenda for those respective houses of the legislature. And so if the Majority Leader is pushing something, it has a lot more weight behind it than otherwise. And so the bill that Senator Nesbitt introduced was referred to his committee, the Senate Committee on Regulatory Reform. It had a hearing 2 weeks ago where a number of college presidents and university presidents testified. Obviously, we were in support, the universities in opposition. Lots of good questions from committee. It came up for a vote yesterday in committee, and it was reported out 6-2 and 1 pass. So a fairly strong bipartisan support for the bill. It is now on the Senate floor, and as we indicated, the Senate is likely not in session very much longer. Some people even think the Senate may leave tomorrow if they get the budget done, but what we're hearing is the Senate will likely be here next week as well. The House will very likely leave tomorrow. They're probably done now because they want to get out and go back home and campaign. But the Senate may stick around another week, and it's next week where we expect the bill to come up for a vote in the Senate on the floor. If that is successful, it will go to the House, and then it'll be up for discussion in lame duck. And as Aaron alluded to, things get a little crazy in lame duck, and you never know what might happen. But this is probably the best chance we've had in a long time to get the BSN enacted into law. I know it's an interest to a number of our college presidents and certainly to Senator Shirkey. So we'll just have to wait and see. But it's an exciting time in this part of the policy debate.
Thanks, Mike. Bill, I wonder, Mike's comments, the community college baccalaureate expands the mission of community colleges, and Jihang talked about explaining the multiple missions of community colleges to federal policymakers. When we were on our planning call, something that really struck me that you talked about is that expanding mission of community colleges and the kind of workforce training we do and the engagement that we have with local employers. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk with everybody about what you think about that, and particularly in the context of how, I don't want to steal your terms, but how community colleges stay relevant.
Yeah, so I have a few really a couple of different feelings when it comes to the baccalaureate degree at the community college. Number one, I think when it comes to the BSN, I think it's so important that our community colleges that are in areas of the state where there's no prominent four-year school with a baccalaureate in science and nursing, that those community colleges, because they exist in those areas, I'm a believer that they need to be able to provide that level of education for that community. It's a community issue, and that needs to be prominent. And it's easy to say, well, but so many of those programs are online. Very true. But as we're finding out right now, there are people across our nation who do not want to be online if they can avoid it. And so how can we provide that in those areas? I will also say that there are many other states across the country that have gone these directions already, aside from nursing, into other areas where the community college has baccalaureate programs. And so I think those are all questions and issues that are worthy of conversation. I also believe that the importance of the community college to our industry partners, when I talk about relevancy, I ask our campus, are we relevant? Are we responsive? Are we relevant in terms of what that education looks like? What does that content look like? Are we relevant when those community partners, those industry partners look at us and say, we need it this way? I don't want to tell them, no, here's what you need. I need them to tell us, what is that worker of today? What does that worker of tomorrow employee for you look like? And how do we come alongside you in preparing that particular individual so that what we're doing stays relevant to what they need? Because one of the biggest mistakes that higher ed has made for centuries is telling industry partners, no, we know what you need. Here's what you need. And they're sitting there going, no, because here's what our shop floor, here's what our lab, here's what these things look like. This is what you need us doing. So it's a come alongside. It's not a get out in front or stay behind. It's a come alongside. But I also think, and I'll wrap it up with this, Erica, I also think in terms of what COVID has proven to us, I think in some cases, we do have that come alongside, yet in some cases, while I'm alongside you, I may have my hand on your back, kind of helping you along. Because for some of our industry partners, they are now realizing coming out of COVID and how things are looking on the other, or tend to look on the other side of COVID, that they're sitting there now saying, okay, what do we need now? How should this space look? And in many cases, I'm hearing from industry partners saying that COVID has sped up some of those processes of moving more toward the digital age, the artificial intelligence age, that is indeed sped up some of those processes. So if we can help inform that alongside them, I want to be that partner, because that's going to speak to the relevance of the community college. Because I'm a believer that if we're not relevant, we can go away just like the last Blockbuster video store that I saw. Can't even remember when it was. They're gone. We could disappear in the same way. I don't want to be Blockbuster. I want to be the one out right with our partners saying, here's where we're going next.
Erica, I see
Thank
that
you.
there's a
We had one more question that came up in the chat. Well, as Stephanie says, be Netflix. I think that's what we want to be now, or we want to be the next Netflix. We had another question in the chat that really kind of speaks to us at the center as we've refocused a lot of our energy around centering equity on a lot of the work that we do. And I know that MCCA and the presidents of the Michigan Community Colleges also made that commitment and that recommitment really earlier this summer as well. Travis from GRCC asked about inequalities that are created by our criminal justice system, and if there are any policies that specifically focus how colleges can support this justice-involved population. So I wonder if this reminds me of some of the legislation that focuses on the Second Chance Pell Grant. So I'm wondering if anyone can speak to that.
I know here in Michigan, just yesterday, we had a resolution passed the House of Representatives, non-binding, but urging Congress to repeal the ban on incarcerated individuals using Pell. 3 of our institutions in Michigan have been part of that Second Chance program and have been strong supporters of it. So now that the Michigan House has spoken, I'm sure Congress will act, right, Jihang?
It is something that we continue to advocate and support, and we've made significant headways. And I would shout out a number of our Michigan community colleges are very active in this area, and we are continuing to push this on the legislative angle. In terms of just some of the tidbits that are going on in the field, for example, 2 of our state systems, one in California and one in North Carolina, they're doing a reassessment of the curriculum and the instruction that they're providing to individuals that for their police academies. And I also would flag for those individuals who have for the boards and for the college presidents on this call. ACCT released a diversity, equity, and inclusion implementation guide for boards. And around policies for boards. So that's something that I would flag. It's on our website under our publications. So it is something that we continue to watch and try to prepare documents and provide guidance to our colleges as they create atmosphere of to deal with a lot of these social inequities that we're having in the field right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll tell you from our perspective in Grand Rapids. So we are having really good conversations with our local law enforcement, and our local police departments, GRPD being one, where we're talking about the fact of our police academy. And by the way, with our police academy, having embedded within that curriculum several pieces of that instruction that center on equity and diversity in terms of policing. So making sure that curriculum is in that level of relevance. But those conversations with those departments, because of our student population as the community college, typically we are a more diverse group of students, and that has been helpful. And I look at Travis talking in terms of, I think I see in his chat, referencing formerly incarcerated individuals. I can get to that in a second, but I think it's important that the partnership with our police departments is vital, specifically with community colleges as having police academies, to try to, and students who are very local in our community colleges, being able to provide those police officers who are going back into their communities in policing and having that familiar face from a community policing perspective and getting back to that. When it comes to the incarceration piece, I know with what Jihang mentioned, and I know Mike and Aaron and Erica are very familiar with our institutions, our community colleges here, Jackson, Mott, and others who are very focused on what does that education look like of returning citizens and even within those who are incarcerated, and what does that look like? We've had conversations ourselves with some of those locations, some of those prisons, to say, what is it that we can do to be a part? Because some of those returning citizens, when I talk about returning, some of them are coming right back to Grand Rapids. So how can we be here for them to get them involved in some programs that will give them those that education and training they need to get into jobs, because we know that when they come back and can engage in those ways, chances of them going back tremendously go down when we're able to connect them to those opportunities and to be very intentional around that. And I think that's the key word, intentionality.
Yeah. And I would just,
oh, go ahead.
yeah, I would just echo that. And, you know, I think crafting legislation around second chance Pell has been, I wouldn't say problematic, but it has been relatively difficult. So for example, in negotiations with congressional staff, especially Chairman Scott's staff, one of the things that they really wanted to advance as an item is that these individuals, especially if they're being educated inside the walls, that they be provided with actual faculty and not have some type of correspondence course opportunity. That all this would be, you know, they would have the FaceTime with instructors and faculty members. As you all know, in this pandemic period, all this type of education has been complicated for many of our students inside the walls. I think I had a conversation with Jackson. I think they had a decline in their enrollment, and it could be directly tied to their students that are currently incarcerated. And I think that we just have to figure out how to shape pieces of legislation to offer some flexibility, because I would imagine that this current situation that we're living in of the coronavirus pandemic might arise in some other point in time, and we just have to be prepared and flexible enough to ensure that our institutions are still able to provide instruction to this critical student body.
And I was just going to add, while it's not work that our community college association has been directly involved with, the Michigan legislature over the last several years has really made tremendous strides on criminal justice issues. I know Mike and I both worked on some of these issues 10 and 20 years ago when it was much more of a tough on crime approach. And it would have been difficult to imagine some of the steps that they're taking, both on the front end to look at how we fund and fundamentally changing how we fund indigent defense in the state of Michigan so that we can ensure that the court system is working better for people on the front end and sentencing, so you don't get to serving or being incarcerated in the first place, as well as for people who are returning to society, looking at those questions of banning the box, looking at licensing issues and where it might be appropriate to change questions of prohibiting people from access to those professions, all of which then open up a number of other options for our students if they can step past an early misstep, or if they're able to ensure that, you know, that doesn't become something that shows up on their record, or if they're able to get those things expunged because of a decision that was made much earlier in their life that they've been able to get past. So it's been very positive from my perspective to see that smart on crime approach starting to take hold here. And there's still a lot of work to be done, but we really are making good strides here in the state.
Erica, there was just one question about public service loan forgiveness, or more of a statement. I would just note for the participant who wrote the question, there was also a move afoot relative to PSLF that you would get some type of loan forgiveness based upon the number of years that you're in a public service position. So if you're, for example, 2 years into a public service occupation, that you would get some type of an amount for each of those years, but that only the broad loan forgiveness would occur at the 10-year mark.
Thanks, Jihang.
Yes.
Appreciate that.
Those around that.
Continuing with this topic, one thing for some of you who may have clicked on the link to the Reconnect, the public act that describes Reconnect, you may have noticed that there's some language in there that would require community colleges or Reconnect participating institutions to make some changes to how they deliver developmental education courses. And we know, having looked at data across the state in Michigan, that some of the most inequitable outcomes for our students are among those students who are placed 2 or 3 levels below college level. And we also see the role that co-requisite remediation can have in giving those students access to college level courses and completing those college level courses and continuing in their program. So this is kind of an asked and answered question, but look forward to, now that we're hopefully seeing Reconnect getting funded, some more support from the center on some of that work, because we know that in looking at our data, some of the biggest equity gaps are as it relates to Dev Ed. So look forward to that in the next year. I'd be crazy if I didn't give the last opportunity to my boss to add any final words. But I have several bosses on this call, so I'm not sure which one to pick, but I'll go ahead and pick the one that writes the checks. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you to see if you have any final thoughts that you want to share with folks as we look to close the session and think about, spend our evenings thinking about federal and state policy. Mike?
Yeah, well, thank you, Erica. First of all, thanks to the panelists. This was a really great, informative, and instructive session, I think. And I hope all of our participants felt the same way. The only one thing my parting wish, I guess, or ask is that public policy work is important. The work that Aaron and I and Bill and Jihang and Eric and everybody does every day is ultimately for students. And the impact we can have is really powerful. But all of you have that same ability. All of you have the same ability to make that kind of an impact. And you know, whether it's writing an email to your local legislator, sending a note, attending an event, stopping by an office hour, calling him on the phone or her on the phone, let them know about the value of community colleges. They want to hear from people like you. You know, community colleges are a big deal for them. You're an important part of the economic development process in their local community. And so don't ever think that your voice doesn't matter, that your thoughts and opinions don't matter, because they certainly do. And just a few people like you reaching out on an issue, whether it's funding for community colleges or supporting the BSN legislation or helping to support Reconnect or Futures for Frontliners, that's just important. Aaron and I are just 2 people here in Lansing. We get paid to do this, but when they hear from constituents, that's what they remember and that's what they'll take back with them. So do your part as well. Get involved even just a little bit, and it really can make a big difference.
Great, thanks, Mike. You got a thumbs up from Jihang, so that's good. So I want to thank all of our presenters again. Thank you, Mike, and for facilitating, and Aaron and Jihang and Bill as well. Just a couple of administrative items here before we sign off. We do have a session evaluation, and I think Katie will put that link in the chat, but then you can also pick up your phone and point your camera at the QR code, and it comes up with just a little short 5-question survey that we do every year to make sure that we deliver a great Student Success Summit for you. So please fill that out for us. And also, as I mentioned early, continue this conversation on Twitter. Our team has been tweeting in the background at MCCACSS using the hashtag MCSS Summit 20. So share your takeaway and reactions and continue the conversation out there. Note that this is week 2, day 4 of the Student Success Summit. So we have 2 more days to go. So we look forward, we have a great conversation that's happening with some higher ed and community college researchers tomorrow, and some fun, interesting outcomes of the guided pathways work that all of you have been doing over the last several years on Friday. So thanks so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you later this week. Have a great evening.